Mr. Commissioner, today we are going to be addressing the topic of stock assessment, and we have two new witnesses. Well, we have two witnesses, one of whom you've met before, and one of who is new to you. We have Timber Whitehouse and Brian Riddle. So maybe you could go ahead and swear these witnesses.
Mr. Whitehouse, you solemnly affirm that the evidence we give you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I so affirm.
Would you state your full name, please?
My name is Timber Reginald Whitehouse.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Dr. Riddle, you've already testified in these proceedings, and we've reviewed your qualifications on other days. I just want to highlight a couple of things to do with stock assessment in particular. From 1979 to 2001, you were a research scientist at the Department of Fisheries and at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and you were the program manager for various programs and sections related to Pacific salmon stock assessment. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Including population genetics research and international fisheries issues relating to Pacific salmon stock assessment?
Yes.
And then sometime in 2001 and through to part of 2004, you were the science advisor for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. I was a secondment from Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
That's correct. Specifically, I was away from the department from September 2001 through March 2004.
And then you returned to the department in March '04 and became the advisor on Pacific salmonoids at the Office of the Director, Science Branch.
Yes.
And from 2005 to 2009, you were the division head, Salmon and Freshwater Ecosystems, Science Branch DFO.
That's correct.
EAN 285162. And it's on the screen in front of you. You have a Bachelor's of Zoology from UBC.
That's correct.
You were a fisheries technician at the International Pacific Salmon Commission from 82 to 83.
Correct.
And you've been with the department since 1984.
That is correct.
And you've been a research technician in various capacities and have been within the stock assessment division up to the present.
Correct.
And from 2005 to the present, you have been the area chief of Fraser River Salmon Stock Assessment Program.
Correct.
And as area chief for the Fraser River Salmon Stock Assessment Program, you're responsible for enumeration of sockeye spawning escapements in the Fraser River.
That's correct.
And the Fraser River Salmon Stock Assessment Program provides science support for stock assessment, including determining production and processes affecting production of salmon in the Fraser River watershed.
That is correct.
And I take it that the Stock Assessment Division deals with other salmon stocks in the Fraser River watershed, not just sockeye.
That's correct. We're responsible for assessment of all 5 species that are under federal jurisdiction.
And your work is exclusively in the freshwater environment?
Yes, we work exclusively within the freshwater environment.
Thank you. And I haven't spent a lot of time looking at your CV, but I would like it marked to go into the record as an outline of your history with the stock assessment portfolio. Could that be marked as the next exhibit? Going through some of the current programs for Fraser River sockeye stock assessment, and the questions are primarily directed to Mr. Whitehouse to begin with. So I'd like if you could please just go through with me in an overview, what are the Fraser River stock assessment programs that are currently being used by the department?
Yes, certainly. Highlight that we are a science-based program working on all species, as we mentioned earlier. We work on the Fraser River sockeye assessment. That includes the terminal area escapement estimation, estimation of juvenile life history stage abundances within the watershed, number of locations. We also work on the evaluation and assessment of the data collected within those programs, and in capacity of forecasting the program abundances associated with annual sockeye forecasting for production purposes. We also work on Chinook and Coho stocks, so we have a program organized under Chinook and Coho. It contributes to exactly the same elements, the assessment of adult escapement within the watershed, We also evaluate juvenile abundance and life history characteristics, and have a component that is involved in the production, forecasting, and technical evaluation of data collected in association with the management programs that we operate there. We also have a program that focuses on chum and pink salmon within the watershed, collecting the same types of information on a limited basis with those two species. That, in a nutshell, wraps up the major focus with respect to the work that we do.
Okay, I'm going to go then into a little bit more detail on some of those. Just identify, I think we'll come back to this in more detail, but just to identify now, there are, and I think you've confirmed that you do escapement enumeration on spawning grounds.
That's correct. Escapement enumeration involving the assessment of adult spawning stocks of salmon as they return to their spawning grounds, including the detailed assessment and calculation of abundance. We also work on programs that help characterize biological attributes or traits of the populations that we've assessed on the spawning grounds.
Okay. And then just to kind of go through some of these other programs, because we'll spend a bit more time on the adult programs. Do you do fry assessments?
We do fry assessments. There are a number of fry assessments that occur within the watershed. Assessments of fry production out of incubation habitat, that is newly emergent fry, spring programs. Those are directly operated within the mandate of my program. We also undertake, in conjunction with the habitat assessment science component at Cultus Lakes Labs, assessments of summer fall fry abundances in sockeye nursery lakes throughout the watershed, and in conjunction with that, there are frequently follow-up assessments of fall fry abundances within nursery lakes and in the watershed.
And are those assessments done on all systems within the Fraser watershed?
No, they're not done on all systems. They're done on a select few throughout the watershed, largely strategically focused based on information requirement needs.
Where are they done?
When we talk about spring projects, those have been done recently out of artificial spawning channels throughout the watershed, so that would be at Nadina, at Gates Creek, and from the horsefly spawning channel as well as weaver spawning channel. Fall or summer fry assessments for sockeye abundance in nursery lakes have been largely restricted to, in recent years, the Shuswap system and the Quesnel system. As well, there has been some recent work done at Choco Lake.
Okay. And are those assessments done on a yearly basis in the sites you identified?
They're done as required and largely associated with information needs. There's not necessarily a need to do assessments every year annually. If you think about the information need, it largely relates to fry recruiting from large spawning abundances. So it occurs in the year following large escapements to systems.
And just to make sure we all know what you're talking about, when you talk about a fry assessment, what are you counting on a fry assessment? You're counting how many fish in a system, and how do you do that?
Different techniques depending upon the life history stage that we're attempting to evaluate in the context of fall fry or spring fry programs. We're looking at marker capture programs, using capture techniques as fry migrate from their spawning gravel downstream into the nursery lakes. So we use largely marker captures there, or out of the spawning channels they use what are called proportional fraction samplers. We're talking about the assessment of summer or fall fry in nursery lakes. We're dealing with a different technique altogether there. We use in-lake hydroacoustic techniques to evaluate total populations. In both cases, back to your original question to frame, we are attempting to estimate total sockeye fry abundance at the particular life history stage. So spring programs, that would be in relation to fry migrating from the gravel into the nursery lake. In the case of a summer fry estimate, we're talking about estimating fry abundance in the June timeline within the nursery lake using a hydroacoustics. And then in the fall, again, a hydroacoustics-based estimate, total abundance of fry based on distribution of surveys throughout the lake.
Okay. And were those types of fry surveys done under the old International Pacific Salmon Commission?
Yes, there's been estimation of fry abundance has been a component of the data and information collected on a regular basis for Fraser River sockeye assessment back to the IPSFC days.
And how, once that information has been collected by your group, how is that information used in Fraser River sockeye management?
It informs a number of pieces of process. First of all, I think most importantly, you have to look at what the information may provide in terms of understanding potential production bottlenecks. With respect to fry data, we're looking to understand whether or not there are limitations associated with incubation habitat quality. Are the number of spawners present on the spawning grounds sufficient to demonstrate a reduced fry production in relation to the numbers of fry present, or spawners present, excuse me. In the case of the in-lake nursery assessments, the summer and fall assessments, we're looking to get an understanding of the impact of various levels of fry entering a lake on that lake's ability to produce sockeye. Concept called carrying capacity from a biological perspective, and an understanding of whether or not the fry entering the lake may have their survival affected by the numbers that recruit into the lake. These have the potential to feed into production forecasting if the data are collected in a consistent manner. They also have the benefit in terms of strategic program implementation, that they may tell you that there are issues in terms of potential fry output for a given year in a given stock.
So can you explain what that means? And
I think the key concept would be if we're seeing situations where we've got high abundance recruiting into a sockeye nursery lake, if in undertaking summer or fry fall estimates, for example, would tell us whether or not the expected abundance produced the subsequent spring would be average, greater than average, or less than average.
okay. And the next area I wanted to cover is nursery lake productivity assessments, and I think this is something different from what you've just been talking about. Is that right?
That is correct. They are linked. We're talking about habitat assessments of nursery lakes. We're dealing with a discipline called limnology. The purpose of the assessment in these cases is to determine ecosystem type impacts or the linkages between Fraser River sockeye and the lake that they're rearing in. Nursery lake productivity assessments involve detailed assessment of algae communities, zooplankton communities, which are the food bases which sockeye feed on, as well as the chemical and physical properties of the lake, nutrients present in the system that support the sockeye food webs. I mentioned earlier the concept of carrying capacity, the ability of a lake to support sockeye, juvenile sockeye, Nursery lake productivity assessments are used to give us a handle on what the capacity based on the linkage between the juvenile assessment and the limnological parameters are.
And where does this, what's the breadth of this limnology program? How many lakes are examined in your program?
Well, over the years, most of the major nursery lakes within the Fraser drainage have been assessed. The key focus in recent years has been on the Shuswap Lake system, Quesnel Lake, and Chilko Lake.
So how often is work done to review or assess the limnology, if that's the way to phrase it, in these lakes?
The strategic approach that is taken in terms of assessing is a follow-up normally associated with the years of large abundance, spawning abundance, so that it would occur in the year following a large spawning abundance. Very predictable in the context of the Shuswap system. That's a system which is dominant and subdominant on the 2002, 2006, 2010 cycle for dominant, and 2003, 7, and 11 on the subdominant. So important to be conducting the limnology assessments on those years. Similarly at Quesnel, it follows on the year that juveniles are rearing from large spawning escapements.
So it's done simply on certain cycle lines for those lakes that you've described?
Those are the important or critical pieces of information that need to be collected, yes.
And so would it be just 1 year out of 4, or would it be 2 years out of 4, or how would it be done?
It could be 1 or 2 years out of 4, depending upon escapement abundances.
Okay. And have those, I'm sure I'm not using this terminology properly, but have those limnological assessments been done to a greater degree in the past, or what's the status if you were to compare to the past type of work done and today? Is it more or less today, or the same?
There has been a period associated with the old IPSFC, the International Pacific Salmon Commission, period prior to 1985, when there was a structured program that evaluated nursery lake capacity on a regular basis. It would have been structured very much in the way I'm identifying here, although they would have wanted to collect baseline information to understand what a lake looks like under a low abundance versus a high abundance situation in terms of fry recruiting into the system. And once you get that baseline information out of the limnological surveys, then it becomes more important to do follow-up in terms of these dominant abundance years, to look at the impact of sockeye fry as they graze on the food source in the lake, to see the impacts that they're having on the nursery and its capacity. One of the outputs and the linkage back to the fry programs we talk about is a lake that is not being heavily grazed produces big fry. A lake that is being grazed heavily, such that there may be competition for the food resources, produces smaller fry. As the densities of fry get higher in the lake due to large spawning escapements, you'll see a signal from the fish population that their fry size decreases in either the summer or fall surveys.
Dr. Riddell, you have something to add?
Maybe just to emphasize a couple of points that Timber is talking about here. But when we do the fry assessments, you should really think of that as probably the sort of first level assessment of the management objectives. These objectives tend to be set on a spawner to fish recruiting to fishery and then subsequent spawners, so adult to adult. But one of the ways that we track whether or not these are in the appropriate range, are they too high, are they too low, well, then we do the ecological assessments on whether you're getting good production and survival of the fry, right? So Timber talked about the early assessment of fry in the gravel, and we use that to look at habitat capacity of spawning areas. that you can estimate management objectives simply based on available spawning space. Right? There are estimates of those. When you start talking about the nursery lake productivities, I simply wanted to bring out that there's actually been two major thrusts. There has been the work done by the old IPSFC and evolved into the current program. There was a serious effort through the mid-70s and through the 80s in science branch, well, at that time it was the Fisheries Research Board. And Dr. John Stockner did extensive work on the limnology, productivity, and fish communities of the Fraser Lake systems. So you could look at what are the appropriate carrying capacities of those lakes and what are production potentials. Where would you choose to invest money in spawning channels or lake enrichment as an enhancement program, for example? So Science Branch was looking at that time at opportunities for development. And where there has been dams built, for example, we have spawning channels. What is the effect of the fry production out of those? So those problems come in. And I also want to bring up in the limnological work, there is extensive work done on trawling, and the reason for that is that the fish community of the lake also determines what the sockeye productivity can be. There are, of course, sockeye lake fish called kokanee, which are resident in the lake. They are also counted on the hydroacoustics. And so the department developed this trawl system. So they do the hydroacoustics, but it has to be matched with an extensive program of trawling so you're going to get the species identification. Mr. Commissioner, is very, very similar to the idea of the hydroacoustics discussion last week, and you have to associate that with a test fishery in some way to identify the targets. It's the exact same idea.
So the trawling allows you to do the species composition to go with the hydroacoustic count?
That's right, and it's not just salmon in the lakes. And one of the biggest competitors are things like sticklebacks. Can be in very, very large abundances, and they can be very productive and actually become a food sink, because the food that you're trying to enhance through lake enrichment under salmon, the salmon enhancement program, if you don't have the right zooplankton community or fish community, you can't get the food to the sockeye. Right? And we definitely have found many examples where we've tried fertilization and stopped because you're not able to get it to sockeye.
You're just feeding the other species.
You're feeding the other animals in the system, yeah.
The baseline analysis that was done by the old commission, has that been reassessed in recent years, or is that work still, do you still rely on the baseline work that was done 20 years ago? 20 plus years ago?
I think it's, there was an add-on associated with the fertilization program that Brian talked about. That did a fairly extensive, broad survey of nursery lakes within the Fraser in the 80s and 90s. But since that time, there has been little, we would call that synoptic work, looking at the production capacities across a broad range of lakes to determine whether there have been changes relative to earlier assessments. That work has not really had much follow-up since the mid-1990s.
And is that work that needs to be done?
I think periodically there's a considerable value.
Well, I think periodically is the right term, because the determining factors in productivity can be the lake morphology, which is not going to change very quickly, except if you have differences of the river inputs and so the nutrients, and that the rate of turnover of the water mass itself, and that's actually highly predictable if you know the flows from the rivers and the morphology, and the clarity of the water. And those sort of three key parameters determine how frequently you really need to go back. Now, if the development around the lake substantially changes, then yes, you would have a different nutrient input. Even that doesn't change very quickly. And so you really don't need to be there always, but you do need to be vigilant and sort of tracking what's the status of development around the lake and what's the flows to the lake and so on.
And is there a program within science then to do that kind of qualitative assessment as to whether or not you need to go back and do a more detailed baseline analysis?
Probably have to leave that to Timber locally. I think that there's no question that we were trying to maintain a regular monitoring, like periodical, as Timber referred to. Whether we're doing the shoreline monitoring, I'm less certain of that.
I'll actually add one more condition that does warrant a follow-up, in addition to the development issues that Brian spoke about, and that is any particular major shifts associated with sockeye abundance. Sockeye carcasses themselves represent a potential source of nutrients coming into a system where there's a likelihood that large numbers of sockeye could actually boost nutrients in the system. I think there is a pretty strong rationale to include those types of events as ones that would warrant follow-up. Sockeye can have an effect on subsequent sockeye production by delivering nutrients from the marine environment into nursery lakes. So clarification, just a bit of additional information to what Brian had said regarding an ongoing program to assess these aspects. There is a program. It is we have been successful to this point in continuing to keep it running. It operates out of the Cultus Lake Lab, as I mentioned earlier. The opportunity to assess the key systems that I had mentioned earlier, Shuswap, Quesnel, and the Chilco, has been maintained, but we haven't been able to look at many systems in the Fraser beyond those in recent times.
And when it was under the old Salmon Commission, was that assessment done on a greater number of lakes than the 3 you identified that are currently being done?
Not only the IPSFC, DFO in the 80s and 90s, as I mentioned earlier, had a more structured approach to delivering these assessments, such that we visited most of the major nursery lakes as a follow-up to work done by the IPSFC in the 70s. So in the 80s and 90s, there were periodic follow-ups to look at baseline levels of production within lakes, as well as investigating these events associated with large escapement.
Right, and I'm still not sure, is there right now a program for within DFO where you are able to go and do that qualitative assessment on the different lakes beyond the 3 you identified to see if it's time to update that baseline information? For example, if there's large carcass inloads into the lakes.
Yeah, it's quantitative, not qualitative work, just as to clarify there.
Sorry, I thought that the point was that you only need to do it when there's certain changes done, and I was assuming that was sort of a qualitative assessment, but maybe I was wrong on that.
Well, I think Timber's point is that the work by its very nature is quantitative, so you have a comparison with the past.
Yeah, no, I understood. I was just as to when it's time to redo that baseline, perhaps that's also a quantitative assessment. I had understood it otherwise. But.
The capacity exists. We have a group within the department that focus on limnology and lake acoustics and trawl surveys. So yes, we still have an existing program.
Maybe as an example, the one system that we have not been able to maintain as regular a system on was monitoring of the Stewart Tackless system, and that was done under IPSFC, and that it's actually a challenging system because the abundances are relatively low, and it was always one that was really difficult to actually address. I think that there's some work going on with First Nations up there, but I do not believe it's presently funded under the core programs.
No, you're correct, Brian. There a number, Francois Lake, Fraser Lake,
yeah.
the big group of the Stewart system lakes. There's also systems like Harrison Lake and the Pitt Lakes, which in context of overall nursery capacity within the system warrant a review on a periodic basis.
Another area I wanted to go over with you were smolt assessments, so that's different from what we've talked about with respect to fry assessments. Could you just review what those are and how often they're done, etc.?
Yeah, I'll just step back because I think Brian made a good point when he was talking about the life history stages. Smolts are, just to clarify what we're talking about, smolts are sockeye just as they leave their nursery lake on the journey towards the ocean to spend another 2.5 years in the ocean before they return as adults. So they've reared in the lake for a full year and they're leaving the nursery to make an oceanward migration. We have two systems within the Fraser where we have been able to regularly monitor smolt output. These are direct counts of smolts. So we're talking about making estimates of total smolt output on a year-by-year basis. The most important system that we monitor is Choco Lake. And in that system, we generate an annual estimate of total smolt abundance out of the system based upon subsampling technique where we put a fence in the river, direct all smolts that are leaving the system through that fence, and generate photographic estimates of their total abundance on the way out. This gives us a couple of pieces of information that are quite important to understanding life history of Fraser sockeye. First is the relative production of smolts from a given brood year that leave a lake. That tells us the production between egg deposition, which is the number of eggs that females lay in the gravel in their spawning year, and to the subsequent survival to the smolt stage. We can then break the life history, at least survival, of sockeye into two discrete components, because we'll have information from eggs to smolts, and because we enumerate adults as well, we'll have information from smolts to returning adults. There's two survival stanzas that you can there get out of that. We also do smolt enumeration at Cultus Lake. Cultus is a smaller system in the lower Fraser. Also has a fence, and in the case of Cultus, we do complete, because it's a much smaller system, we can count every smolt out of the system. So they move through a fence into a trap box and are counted out on a daily basis.
Cultus has not been consistent to the degree that Chilco was. And Cultus has a very long history where we actually did some of the original studies of sockeye biology in the 20s and the 30s in Cultus Lake, and one of the earliest hatchery programs. But Chilco is, without question, the best set of sockeye data in British Columbia, right? Because we have a sockeye counting fence at Chilco since 1948, and it's been done every single year. I believe that's true.
That's correct.
And we get smolt size and number, length and weight, scale samples, and that. So it's quite different than really talking. Shouldn't make a direct comparison, I guess what we're saying, in terms of consistency to Cultus Lake.
Right.
It's been done when the stock was subsequently quite depressed, and we're looking at recovery now.
And I know that you weren't working on this in 1948, I don't think, but do you know why Chilco was chosen as a smolt counting environment?
You know, I've looked for that myself, to be honest, and I think Mr. Roos's book is the only place I've ever really seen a discussion of that. And I think it really comes down to sort of a unique environmental situation. It's a very, very wide laminar flow. You can put a fence in there. There's a lot of flow of water going by, but it's a very wide area, so the pressure front can be, you know, you can hold a fence in there. If you went to the outlet of Quesnel Lake, well, you're going through a canyon, and so you have a very difficult time working that environment. I think something was asked me like this previously. You might do something like this at the outlet of Shuswap Lake, and that because you have a very wide system there, but you have a much higher flow going through there. It's much more difficult. I think it really is a rather unique environment. People talk about doing it at the outlet of Stewart Lake, for example, and that, but it's very wide, and it'd be a much, much bigger fence. So it's probably just a choice of a number of trade-offs they had to make at the time.
And it's probably obvious, but just to confirm, this is a continuation of a program that was in place under the IPSFC.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great.
And it's been, I take it it's been upgraded as new equipment has become available, but it's essentially the same program with newer and better ways to count. Is that right?
The methodology has been very consistent through time. You're right, there have been modifications, updates to the fence, to the trap boxes, etc., that make it more efficient to operate, but the principle behind the enumeration program has been consistent and maintained in that manner through time.
Okay.
I'll add one more thing. I think there's a very, Brian is correct in his characterization of why Chilco is selected. In addition to the very wide nature, it's shallow. This is one of the key issues, that it is actually workable through the range of water levels that you get during smolt out migration. So the water levels, it's a high alpine lake, and as such, it experiences a very late spring in terms of water runoff. So the flows and water levels are low and stable through the period of smolt emigration, making it actually doable. Many of the other systems, the water comes up so much during the period of smolt migration that it's just not tractable to put a fence in for the purposes of enumerating.
And just to close off on cultus, the cultus system is somewhat different from other systems in BC in that it is a hatchery system to a large extent, that what you're counting in the smolt fence are hatchery fish to a large extent, is that right?
Well, it's not specifically a hatchery system until very recently. So there's been a great deal of enhancement work that has gone on at cultus associated with its endangered status. Cultus sockeye are listed as endangered. The department has a recovery strategy and plan to support the recovery of that stock. One of those components relates to enhancement. And recently, one of the important facets of the work at the fence at cultus in Swelter Creek is evaluating the survival of the various hatchery strategies. There are a number of different strategies to release juveniles from the hatchery back into the wild, and we're looking at the fence to determine which strategies are effective. There are marks that are applied to the fish to be able to follow them as juveniles in the lake smolts through the fence, and then actually marks that you can see on the adults as they return to get a feel for the efficacy of the various enhancement strategies. So that's where enhancement comes into play, and hatchery fish at cultus.
Okay, but because of that, the fish that you're counting in cultus are somewhat different in that they do have a mix of hatchery and wild fish that you don't have, for example, in Chilco or in some of the other systems.
That's correct. In no other systems within the Fraser that we're enumerating juveniles on are we dealing with hatchery enhanced components.
Okay. The Chilco stock, you had said that the enumeration of smolt gives you two components of information, one egg to smolt and then one smolt to returning adult, so kind of the freshwater lifetime and then the marine, if I can call it that, lifetime coming back. Is the Chilco stock a valid indicator for other stock in the system for both of those time frames, the freshwater environment and then the marine environment? Can you say that what you see with the Chilco stock can be extrapolated to the other systems for both of those life phases?
First of all, I should identify what indicator means. It has a specific meaning in terms of the terminology we use. Indicator meaning representative of other stocks, groups, or life history stages throughout a broader range. You would, in developing an indicator stock, pick one group to be representative of one stock to be representative of a much larger group of stocks. So your question was, is it a valid indicator to represent life history, freshwater life history, egg to smolt production within the Fraser for all groups? That would be a significant stretch, and I would say no, it would not be. Chilco is quite a unique system. So as an indicator for freshwater productivity in the watershed, Chilco is unlikely to be an indicator. Is it an indicator of the marine life history survival stage? I would say there's a qualified yes to that. The reason I say it's qualified is we don't fully understand what's going on from the time smolts leave their nursery lake till the time they hit the ocean, and there's a very broad range of migration distances within the Fraser, such that some fish are moving 1,500 kilometers out of their nursery lakes from the very top end of the Fraser, whereas others are only migrating tens of kilometers out of the lower Fraser before they hit the marine environment, potentially subject to different survival effects along that migration corridor. However, in terms of marine survival patterns, there is quite a synchrony associated with sockeye movement into the marine environment. Sockeye migration, smolt migration begins about April in the lower Fraser. You'll start to see sockeye smolts occur. By the end of June, the main body of the total run has gone by. Those fish are then migrating within the marine environment, largely en masse. So is it reasonable to assume it's a marine survival indicator? Qualified, yes.
Well, if I could add, empirically, for marine survival, over time it actually has been a very good indicator, actually. And that Mr. Alcass, that you'll be interviewing next week, has for a number of years tracked what we call the covariation. And that, so what he looks at is adult to adult returns, and from that you can apply marine productivity rates. Well, you get productivity rates over the whole lifespan, and then he can plot with that the actual estimate of smolt to adult survival, which is a true measure of what we can get from marine survival, and the correlation is very high. The lakes actually have a covariance of about 0.7, so about half of the annual variation is accountable from lake to lake. And so as an indicator of marine survival, it's actually been quite good until recent years. In the most recent period, where we're talking about the rate of rapid decline in productivities, Choco's survival seems to be tracking down a little worse than some of the other lakes, and so it seems to have separated. But up until certainly within the past decade, it's been a very good indicator of marine survival. And I would agree with Timber completely on the adult spawning to smolt. It's a very unique environment that's not representative of the other productivities.
Okay, and for the period of decline that you just indicated, do we have any indicator stock that allows us to assess marine survival?
I mean, you're still getting an estimate of, you're getting the only direct measure of marine survival in the Fraser is the Choco Lakes smolts. The fish coming out of cultish, you can get another measure, but many of the tagged fish that you've got the estimates for are hatchery-based juveniles. There's actually a wide variety of recovery plans being attempted in Cultish Lake, so there's a few different life histories. So there's no really direct measure of the marine survival change outside of Choco Lake.
So you'd indicated, though, up until the past decade, there was very good, it worked very well as an indicator of the other systems. What's been done in the past decade to account for changes in that system, that it may not be such a good indicator anymore?
There has been no adjustment of the indicator because there's no other opportunities. What we're comparing that against is the other systems that is the sort of backdrop for comparing Choco are the adult to adult return rates. And if you plot those through time, you see this trend that really the Commission has really been asked to explain the rate of decline of Fraser sockeye. That's really looking at adult returns to adult spawners. So if you look at Choco smolt to adult returns or the marine survival estimate, it's tracking a little below that. And that as if there's a little bit poorer marine survival from that system than the others in the Fraser. Now keep in mind, when you do a total for the Fraser in total, in 2 out of 4 years, that will be heavily affected by the fall return, and particularly Shuswap Lake complex, which has not shown the rate of decline that the other sockeye lakes have. Right, so what you're getting is an averaging effect where the big returns in the fall runs are keeping that average up in 2 out of 4 years.
Speaker, can I just ask a couple of quick questions on this point that Mr. Whitehouse referred to? If I understood it, you mentioned migration corridors within the Fraser for the out-migration. Are the corridors fairly well tracked in terms of research? Or what did you mean by migration? I think I know what you mean, but I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding your point.
Yeah, to clarify, all smolts within the Fraser obviously leave through the Fraser.
Right.
They share common areas, so upriver stocks, the stocks originating above the Nechako, for example, are in a common migration corridor from the Nechako-Fraser confluence through the remainder of their migration down to Steveston.
Okay.
Stocks that enter below that are obviously going to only share a portion of the total migration. And your question is very much germane to the understanding of survival patterns within the watershed, because if there are different factors affecting survival during that period between which they leave their lake and which they reach the marine environment, could be related to how far they're moving through the system.
I see.
So where they share common, and my point with Chilko is that until the Chilko smolts hit the main stem of the Fraser, they're in a unique migratory corridor on their own, and it's quite a dynamic environment above there. If there are survival effects that occur between the lake outlet and the confluence, that may not represent what's going on throughout the rest of the watershed. Brian's work in conjunction with our program on the Chilko smolts is last year an acoustic tagging program to look at the in-river survival estimates of smolts. Is the first attempt that we've made, as this is brand new technology, to actually understand what the survival patterns for sockeye are during their migration between their nursery lake and entry into the marine environment. So we don't understand those dynamics well at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that actually is a perfect lead-in, because the last program I wanted to talk about here was the Chilko tagging program, and we touched on it just in a few words when you were here before, Dr. Riddell, but perhaps now you could explain in more detail what that program is.
Well, the Chilko smolt tagging was really, last year was our very first year. It was definitely a pilot study, and it was applying sonic tags to naturally produced sockeye salmon smolts leaving Chilko Lake, and using the post-detection system that we brought up last week under hydroacoustics. So these are tags that are actively transmitting a unique signal. Every fish is therefore identifiable, and we put receivers down the river. And then there are an array of receivers in the lower Fraser, and then there's lines of receivers in the Strait of Georgia up into Queen Charlotte Sound. And that those lines are what people refer to as the post arrays. And it was exactly as the commissioner asked when I was investigating the whole issue of what was contributing to the decline and what we knew and we didn't know. I contacted what I call the god of sockeye, Jim Woody. And he said, no, we've never actually been able to monitor that the first real study effort was in the mid-60s. And there's actually been no effort to study the survivorship of downstream within Fraser mortality of smolts. So the tagging technologies that have been developed now for small salmon provides us the first opportunity to do it. I call it a pilot because the tags are only so small. We were not able to put tags in any fish. I don't think we put any tags in fish less than 12 centimeters. So when people talk about one-year-old smolts for Fraser sockeye, it's not strictly true. You can have 1- and 2-year-old smolts. And 2-year-old smolts are about 50% bigger than 1-year-old. And so what we were tagging is natural fish, but we were tagging the upper maybe 5 to 10% of the size distribution. And to be consistent, they did move downstream very, very quickly. The fish that we detected at the lower river were all through from the outlet of Chilko Lake to the detection arrays at the mouth of the Fraser in 7 to 10 days. But what was extremely surprising is that the survivorship to the mouth of the Fraser was only 25% of the tagged smolts leaving the lake. And that has surprised us a great deal. Now, since it's a pilot study, though, I'd emphasize we're putting the money and the tags together right now to do it again this year. And we're going to take another step up and use the new generation of tags that will allow us to tag down to about 10.5 centimeters. We still can't get down to the average size of the natural smolts, which is more about probably 9 centimeters, 9 or 10.
Actually, closer to 8
Yeah, so
centimeters.
we're still in the upper third of the size distribution. There are other types of tags that could be used to cover the whole array, but you can't detect them as easily at all. It's a very, very difficult task.
And
Do
when
I
you say-
understand, Dr. Riddell, that you don't use any kind of test fishery or hydroacoustic?
No, that's the beauty of this, sir. You tag the fish, you have to put the tag in surgically, so we maintain the fish in controlled conditions.
I see.
We do it very early in the morning. We hold the fish into the late night, and if they're fine, then we release them sort of, I think they're releasing them like 3 or 4 in the morning.
I see.
So it's still dark, and then they're tagged and gone in a day, and there are detections just down from the release site, and if they're detected at that point, then they're counted as a viable tagged fish,
I see.
and we monitor them passively down there, so we never handle them again.
Right.
And who's the we that you referred to? Is it a DFO program?
Well, it's a joint program of a number of groups. The Pacific Salmon Foundation put it together only because it was something that I was interested in and found some donors to support. We did it with UBC and Dr. Scott Hinch because he has teams of people working on the post arrays. Timbers people, DFO maintains the Choco smolt fence, and so they were integral in all of this. And Science Branch contributed some funds to buy some tags. And then Dr. David Welch with Kintama, who's presented to the commission before, he contributed to it by detecting the fish, and he had to upload the data from the arrays in the lower river. And then even the post program is involved because we got the detections in the Strait of Georgia. So this was really a very comprehensive sort of program to really conduct this thing.
And you said you are going to be doing it next year, or 2011 as well?
Yes, we've just put in the order for all the tags. This year, Dr. Scott Hinch has money from what's called the Ocean Telemetry Network for Canada. This is actually part of a worldwide network, and so Dr. Hinch is actually doubling our tags. So we're going to use the tags that I bought last year, which is a particular size range, and the new version of the tag is being bought by UBC. And so we'll actually, instead of having 200 tags last year, we have 400 this year.
Do you anticipate that this program could be used in the future in management of Fraser River sockeye?
Well, right now, the feedback I'm getting is people are concerned about how representative these tags are. I'm not actually prepared to really throw it out that quickly. If we're getting very poor survival on large fish, I don't know why anybody would assume that you get better survival from small fish, except that there is obviously a reason why sockeye leave as relatively small fish. All right, so there is a bit of a trade-off right here in terms of how far we push this. The unfortunate part is the next step down to tag really representative size fish is extremely difficult to do. You have to sample the fish. Again, you'd have to do something like the commissioner was asking before. Now I tag the fish and let them go. We don't have to handle them again. The next step to get to very small fish, you put a passive tag in, and then you have to have an activation system and detection. And this exists in the Columbia Basin, but the thing that Columbia has that Freitas doesn't have are things called dams. Right? And so we don't have sampling sites downriver. And what you could do is actually they actually have huge trawl nets that they have in the river. And the end of the trawl is open. And in there are large arrays of plate detectors. And so basically the water flows through this net. And you can detect the fish doing that, but your detection efficiency is very low. And so it's going down to a new type of tag other than the sonic is actually a major step down. But I don't know that we'll continue doing this. We'll see what happens this year. And that if we find that we get very, very good survival this year, then we've missed something in the 2 years and we'll have to do it again. I am catching people talking about the survival of smolts is only 25%. And I have to keep correcting them that this is 1 year only, very large fish, definitely a pilot. We should not be applying this generally, but I think the number of us that were involved are shocked that the number was so low. That's why we really want to sort out what's the cause of this.
Right. And did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think I want to just provide a little bit more context, because I agree with the way Brian has framed the program. I think if we want to look at what potential it brings to management, assuming it was going to be feasible, assuming that the tags can get to the size that they're detectable for small fish, that there is a real positive benefit to understanding survival patterns for sockeye during that phase from which they've just migrated the lake to their time at which they leave the Strait of Georgia, because that we understand nothing about that survival right now. One of the complexities about forecasting is the sort of black box that the ocean represents, and to be able to conceptually understand 2 years in advance of adult returns what survival impacts we are seeing for smolt stages would be a substantial improvement in not only the lead time on which we understand what type of factors and survival patterns we might be seeing for sockeye stocks, but it would add another piece into the forecast, production forecasting puzzle that may, if it has potential and can move beyond a research tool to a long-term monitoring project, would give us potentially substantially more confidence in forecasting looking forward.
Is Dr. Riddell's program the only realistic or viable program for out-migration that science has so far developed, the tagging system, or are you thinking as well that there might be other opportunities for gaining this information on survival in the out-migration process for sockeye?
Yeah, well, the sockeye qualification is the important one. I mean, it has been used in other species in the Fraser system, but always on larger smolts.
Right.
Right. Now, there is a company trying to build a very small tag that would have a very small battery, and so it would only function for maybe 6 weeks.
Right.
And if you can do that, then the trade-off is it would be very good to get the downstream survival, but you're going to lose it very quickly in the ocean. And the other is, to get very small, you have to go to a very high frequency of transmission, and so you have to have much more expensive receiving arrays, because the range of detection goes down to about 100 meters.
Right.
Right, and it's very, very, one thing that we didn't anticipate how hard it was to figure out is if you're going down the river at the speed of the Fraser, how frequently should you transmit a signal so that when you pass these 1 and 2 detectors that you're actually in the receiving range. Right, and so we pushed it right down to once every 11 seconds, and it probably actually should be a little faster than that. So you're really pushing the range of technology right now to get down there. And that, so we don't expect another big advance in the technology for a few years. So right now, I think we'll go down as small as we can. Even the micro tags that I've just referred to, you'd be very hard pressed to get down to tagging the 8-centimeter fish that Timbers referred to.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.